My name is Donna Wood, and I'm working at the University of Victoria as a postdoc researcher with Dr. E. I'm interested in how Canada manages and governs labour market policy. And this encompasses both the passive programs that help people when they are out of work, and our large passive programs are employment insurance and social assistance in Canada. And it also encompasses active programs, which are the processes to help these people mostly get back to work. So I'm interested in how this policy area is governed on a pan-Canadian basis, because governance is basically shared between the federal and provincial governments in Canada. And I estimate that the government of Canada alone spends about $30 billion on an annual basis on this. And what's happened in Canada, particularly over the last 15 years, is that we have become increasingly decentralized in this area, where provinces and territories are now primarily responsible for this basket of programs. The federal government is involved primarily through a funding process, but also because they have statutory obligations, particularly through the employment insurance program. So I'm looking to discover ways on how could Canada manage this shared governance, decentralized governance better. And so in my studies, I have become aware, particularly starting in 2006, that the European Union has developed new governance mechanisms to facilitate conversations and how they manage governance between the 27 EU member states. And I became increasingly intrigued because they had developed these new techniques, and could some of these techniques help how Canada manages intergovernmental relations in Canada. And so I spent last year in Europe for about 5 months talking to people in Europe about what actually happens, what are the processes that they use. And now I've come back, and what I want to talk to you about is a comparison, a direct comparison of Canada's approach versus the European Union. And when I compare governance approaches, I have basically chosen what principles do you use to assess governance? And I have looked at principles that both systems have agreed are the good principles that they want to attain. And some of these principles include participation and transparency, accountability, openness, clarity of roles, effectiveness. These principles in Canada have been established through the Social Union Framework Agreement, and in the European Union they are part of the White Paper on Governance. So what I've done is I've compared the Canadian approach to the European Union approach around a number of different dimensions, and these dimensions are taken from the governance technique that the European Union uses, which is called the open method of coordination. And in the open method of coordination, the process involves setting strategic goals on an EU-wide basis. Then it involves the individual member states taking those goals within their own policy areas. It involves comparing best practices between the EU member states. It involves doing reports. It involves, quite significantly, a detailed process for including the participation of non-government stakeholders. And in the European words, these are social partners, which is business and industry, and civil society. And certainly in employment policy, business and labor and business are a very significant stakeholder. So basically, these are the processes that the European Union uses, and I have then used these as a way to reflect on how Canada manages this. And what I've discovered through my research are a number of areas. First of all, in terms of strategic goals, the European Union actually has strategic goals. They have goals and targets, and these targets very, very much move them along to achieving a collective EU-wide approach to employment policy. For example, the current EU objective in terms of employment policy is a 75% employment rate across the EU. And this very significantly mobilizes all the EU member states to achieve these objectives. In Canada, we don't have that same kind of perspective. Basically, Canada manages employment policy through a series of bilateral agreements through the federal government and each individual province. In employment policy areas, in the active side, there are basically 4 agreements, and this is the framework under which Canada manages active labour market policy, are these 4 detailed agreements. And one of the most significant ones was the Labour Market Development Agreement, and that actually transferred from the Government of Canada to provinces the responsibility for providing active programs. So that's the Canadian context. The next element is in terms of monitoring and reporting. In the European Union, because they have agreed on common indicators, they have an easy way to actually monitor and report on progress within each individual member state. And this allows them to basically then compare their practices, which helps them then engage in a dialogue for mutual learning processes. From a Canadian perspective, we don't do that. Mostly it's every individual province reporting on their website what they are doing against these particular bilateral agreements. There's very, very little direct comparative work, or even in many ways information or reporting that Canadians could take a look at to see what is happening in this large area that affects many, many Canadians. In Europe, they have a process for actually having conversations between the member states, which they actually call mutual learning, but also mutual surveillance, where they will compare best practices, and we don't do that in Canada. One of the most significant parts in the European Union is that they actually have a detailed process to involve non-government stakeholders, and in Canada we don't. Our process is very much executive dominated, and it's governments that are involved, ministers, but not in many ways the people that are actually delivering the programs. So I think that in conclusion, there are most interesting techniques through the open method of coordination that Europe has used that we could take a look at. We are not the same system. There are all kinds of different parameters, constitutional parameters, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't learn some of the things from the European Union. Surely if they can find ways to have conversations between very, very different 27 member states that are very, very significantly different than Canada's 13 provinces and territories in the federal government, surely there are some ideas there that might be able to assist us to improve how we engage in intergovernmental dialogue in this policy area in Canada, and that would also involve the many, many people and agencies and non-government organizations and business groups that are actually providing these programs to Canadians to help them get back to work.